I had chosen the restaurant deliberately, a place Richard had never been. Quiet, good lighting, the kind of establishment where scenes are not made because the tables are too close together and the other diners are paying too much to be inconvenienced by someone else's family business. I arrived 11 minutes early. I ordered water. I sat with my back to the wall, the way I had learned to sit in rooms I didn't fully trust. And I waited. Richard came in at 7:02. Brittany was behind him, her coat already half off her shoulders, scanning the room before she'd finished walking through the door. She was wearing my earrings, the ones I'd set aside in a drawer before I packed. I hadn't noticed they were missing until that moment. I noticed now. I watched them settle into their seats. I watched Richard pick up the menu and set it down without reading it. I watched Brittany flag the server before anyone had said a word and order a bottle, not a glass, of the second most expensive wine on the list. I looked at my water glass. I had been waiting for this for 37 days. Richard leaned forward. He opened his mouth. I said, I accepted a position in Los Angeles, Senior Regional Director. I start Monday. He closed his mouth. The house sold 3 weeks ago, I said. The wire cleared on a Wednesday evening. Brittany put down her wine glass. I let the silence settle. Not because I was waiting for a response, because I wanted them to feel the full weight of what I had just said before I continued. 3 of your largest accounts have already gone unanswered on their renewal deadlines, I said. I'd recommend calling them before the month closes. I looked at Brittany once, briefly, the way you look at something you used to carry and have finally decided to set down. I picked up my bag. I did not say goodbye. I walked out through the door into the November air, and the city kept moving around me like I had always been part of it. Like the past 12 years had happened to someone standing very still in a room I had finally learned to leave. That was how it ended. This is how it started. To understand what happened at that table, you need to go back 5 months, almost to the day. My name is Valerie. I was 34 years old. I lived alone in a bungalow in East Nashville, a 2-bedroom with Portland white walls, a sofa I'd had reupholstered in a fabric I'd picked out myself from a shop in Germantown, and 3 framed prints that had followed me through every apartment I'd lived in since I was 22. Portland, Athens, Tokyo. I had built that apartment over 6 years. Not quickly, not all at once. The way you build anything that actually lasts. One decision, one weekend, one deliberate choice at a time. I worked as a senior account manager at a commercial property firm downtown. I managed a portfolio of 12 office properties across Tennessee and Kentucky. My supervisor, Ellen, had been trying to promote me to regional director for 2 quarters. I kept telling her I needed more time. In retrospect, I think I already knew I wasn't staying. Every morning, I woke at 5:20. I made a single cup of coffee, French press, medium dark roast, 2 minutes steep, and I sat at the kitchen table by the window for exactly 15 minutes before I did anything else. It was the quietest part of my day. The light came in low and amber. The apartment smelled like coffee and the lavender hand cream I kept by the sink. I had built that quiet. It was mine. I was not unhappy. That's important to understand. I was not waiting to be rescued. I had a life I had assembled myself, from scratch, without anyone's help. My father, Richard, was 61. He ran a small commercial HVAC supply company, the kind of business that's been in the family long enough that everyone assumes it will be there forever, even when the numbers say otherwise. He was proud, in the way men of his generation often are, loudly, and at someone else's expense. My sister Brittany was 29, 5 years younger than me, and she had, as far as I could observe, never paid for anything in her life without someone quietly making up the difference afterward. That someone had, more often than not, been me. I want to be careful here. I am not going to tell you Brittany was a bad person. I'm going to tell you what she did. When Brittany got her first apartment at 23, she needed a security deposit. Richard didn't have the cash that month. I wired $3,100 from my savings on a Tuesday afternoon, Brittany never mentioned it again. At Christmas that year, Richard gave her a Tiffany bracelet and a card that said, "So proud of you for getting your own place." I smiled at dinner. I cleared the dishes. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would have landed the way I meant it. This was the architecture of our family. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet, persistent arrangement in which certain things were expected of me and excused in her. I had learned to live inside it. I had built my life around its edges, in the spaces where no one was looking. On a Thursday night in October, my phone rang at 3:12 in the morning. It was Brittany. Before I could say anything, she was already talking. Not asking, demanding, the way she had always demanded things she believed were owed to her by the simple fact of needing them. She'd been divorced. Her husband had ended the marriage. She was standing outside their house with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. "He threw me out," she said, her voice cycling between sobs and outrage in the practiced rhythm of someone who has always been rescued. "Because I bought a car. Can you believe that? He threw me out over a car. You have to let me stay with you. It's the only option that makes sense right now." I sat in the dark for a long moment. I thought about the 3,100. I thought about every holiday dinner I had cooked and cleaned up after, while Brittany told stories about herself to the table. I thought about every quiet calculation I had made, so that she could live loudly without ever noticing the math. Then I picked up the phone and called her back. "Come over," I said. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. Brittany arrived at 4:15 a.m. with 2 suitcases, a duvet, and a tote bag full of dry shampoo and half-used skincare products. I set her up in the second bedroom, gave her a key, and told her to take whatever she needed from the kitchen. She cried for 3 nights. I brought her tea. I didn't ask her to talk about it until she was ready. By the second week, she had started having people over. Not guests exactly, more like a rotation. Friends who came in the afternoon and stayed through dinner. A man named Connor who appeared on a Wednesday evening and was still there Friday morning. Someone's dog, a golden retriever, who knocked over my French press on a Saturday and left a coffee stain on the Germantown sofa that I'm still thinking about. I didn't say anything. She was going through a divorce. People cope in different ways. The first escalation was the master bedroom. I came home one evening to find Brittany standing in the doorway of the guest room, the room I had prepared with fresh linens, the room I had cleared specifically for her, with her arms crossed and the particular expression of a person who has decided in advance that what they are about to say is reasonable. She said, "I can't stay in this room, Valerie. I need the master suite. I need the bathroom for my routine. I need space to heal from what I'm going through right now." I looked at her. I said, "That's my room. You have a room." She said the guest room was too small for where she was emotionally. I said, "The guest room is where you sleep, or I help you find somewhere else." She glared at me and eventually went to bed, slamming the door hard enough to shift the picture frame in the hallway. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. I set my keys down very carefully on the counter, the way you set something down when you don't trust your hands. I didn't say anything else about it. I should have, but I didn't. 3 weeks after that, I came home to find the walls of the guest bedroom painted. Neon purple. Not accent purple, not dusty mauve, neon purple. The color of a nightclub bathroom in 2008. My 3 framed prints, Portland, Athens, Tokyo, were stacked face down in the corner. Brittany was on the phone when I walked in. She looked up, saw my face, and said, "Oh, I thought you'd like it. It was so boring before." I stood in the doorway for a long moment. I didn't say anything. I went back to the kitchen. I set my keys down on the counter. I could hear my own breathing. She was going through a divorce, I told myself. I could repaint later. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. 2 weeks later, I checked my emergency card. I kept a secondary credit card in a drawer in my home office, a card I hadn't used in 14 months. specifically because it was for emergencies, unexpected medical bills, a sudden repair, a flight home if something happened to someone I loved. The balance was 8,247. I sat down. I went through the statement line by line. 12 transactions over 22 days. A boutique in the Gulch. A nail salon on Church Street. 3 separate charges at a wine bar on 12th Avenue South. A deposit, 1,200, at an event venue I had never heard of. Restaurant charges, ride shares, a clothing subscription I had definitely not signed up for. Brittany had found the card in the drawer. Brittany had used the card. Brittany had spent 8,247 on things that were not emergencies, without asking, without mentioning it, in 22 days. I put the statement down on the desk. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't wake her up. I didn't walk into the neon purple room and ask her what she thought she was doing. I opened my laptop. I made a folder. I labeled it with a date. I put the statement in it. I took a photograph of the purple walls. I pulled up 3 years of bank records and highlighted every transfer I'd made. 3,100 in 2019, 1,400 in 2020, 450 the Christmas she said she'd get me back after the holidays. I saved Richard's voicemail from 2 weeks prior, the one where he said, "Brittany tells me you're not being supportive. I hope you'll think seriously about what kind of family you want to be part of." And I put that in the folder too. I named the folder something boring. Tax documents. Review pending. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. My father came to my office 12 days later. I was in the middle of reviewing lease renewal terms for a property in Murfreesboro when my assistant knocked and said there was someone in the lobby. I asked who. She said, "Your father. He doesn't have an appointment." I told her to send him in. There were 11 people in the open plan office that morning. I know the exact number because I counted them later, when I was trying to understand how I had felt so completely alone in a room full of witnesses. Richard walked to my desk without looking at anyone else. He put both hands on the edge of my desk. Then he lifted one hand and brought it down, open palm hard, on the surface. The sound was very loud. People looked up. He leaned forward and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, loudly enough that his posture said everything to the room. "Brittany called me. She says you're making things difficult. Your duty is to support your sister. That is what family does." He grabbed my arm. I looked at his hand on my arm. I looked up at his face. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pull my arm away. I waited. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. Until he let go on his own. Then I said, "Thank you for stopping by, Richard." I picked up my pen. He stood there for a moment. Then he left. I watched him walk out through the glass doors. I watched him press the elevator button. I watched the doors close. Then I opened a new browser tab. I typed 2 words into the search bar. "Cash buyers," she told me on a Wednesday evening. Cabo, 7 days. A girls' trip. Something she needed for her mental health. She asked if I'd water the plants while she was gone. I said yes. I watched her wheel her suitcase out the front door. I watched the lift pull away from the curb. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and I opened the folder. I'd been adding to it for 31 days. By the time Brittany's flight took off, the folder contained the credit card statement, 12 transactions, 8,247. Photographs of the second bedroom, 3 angles, including the prints stacked face down. A text thread in which Brittany had sent me a string of emojis after I'd asked, very calmly, when she planned to repay the card. The 3-year transfer history. Richard's voicemail, 7 minutes and 43 seconds. I had listened to it 4 times. The search results had given me 3 names. I called the second one on a Monday morning from my car before I walked into the office. Her name was Sarah, She'd sold 3 properties in my neighborhood in the past 14 months. I'd looked her up the night before, cross-referenced closing dates against county records, checked the gap between list price and final sale. She was good. She was fast. I asked her one question. Do you work with cash buyers? She said, all the time. I asked, if I needed to move quickly, what does quickly look like? She said, 72 hours if the price is right, 48 if it's priced to close. I said, I'll call you back tomorrow. The email from Marcus Webb had been sitting in my inbox for 22 days. Subject line, Regional Director position, formal offer, Los Angeles. I had opened it once the day it arrived, read the first paragraph, closed it, and told myself I needed more time. On Tuesday morning, I opened it again. Double salary, signing bonus, $14,500, relocation package included, start date flexible within 90 days. I read it twice. Then I clicked reply. I typed 11 words. I'm ready to move forward. Can we speak this week? I hit send at 8:47 a.m. Marcus called at 11:15. We spoke for 22 minutes. By the time I hung up, I had a verbal confirmation, a DocuSign request waiting, and a start date of the first Monday of the following month. I signed the offer letter at 12:04 p.m. from a conference room I'd booked under a fake meeting title. I didn't tell Ellen. I didn't tell anyone. Sarah called back Wednesday afternoon. She had a buyer. Cash. Pre-approved through a private investment group she worked with regularly. They wanted to close in 5 days. They were offering market value, $387,000, plus a $4,200 closing cost credit. I asked her one question. Is the wire irrevocable once confirmed? She said, once it clears escrow, yes, fully irrevocable. I said, send me the paperwork. I reviewed the purchase agreement that evening at my kitchen table. Brittany's succulents were on the windowsill. The purple walls were visible through the open bedroom door. I signed every page. Sarah called at 11:47 p.m. to confirm the wire had cleared. I put the phone down on the table. Outside, the street was completely quiet. I could hear the refrigerator. I could hear my own breathing. The house was no longer mine, which meant, as of 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in November, it was no longer hers either. The call is not available for cover. I set the alarm for 1:45. The crew arrived at 2:07 a.m. 3 men, a truck, 4 hours. I had labeled every box myself. Kitchen, books, office, bedroom. I had been packing in small increments for 11 days, one drawer at a time after Brittany went to sleep, so that nothing looked obviously different from one morning to the next. The only things left untouched were Brittany's. Her 2 suitcases, her tote bag of dry shampoo, the 3 Hermes boxes stacked on the shelf in the hallway, unopened, the way people store things they bought to feel better and then forgot about. I left them exactly where they were. Before the crew arrived, I made one last cup of coffee. French press, 2 minutes steep. I sat at the kitchen table by the window. It was 1:30 in the morning, and the light didn't come in amber at that hour. It was just dark outside. But I sat there anyway, because I had built that quiet, and I was taking it with me. At 5:58 a.m., the last box went into the truck. I walked through the apartment one time. Portland white walls in the hallway. The kitchen window, where I'd sat every morning for 6 years. The living room, where I'd assembled the sofa frame on a Sunday afternoon in March, alone, with a glass of wine and a YouTube tutorial. I turned off the lights. I locked the door with the key fob. I did not look back. I didn't leave a note. I didn't call Richard. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I had already said everything I was going to say. In 31 days of documentation. In a folder labeled Tax Documents, Review Pending. In a wire transfer that cleared at 11:47 p.m. In 11 words sent to a man in Los Angeles at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. I had said it in every room I stayed quiet in, every dinner I sat through, every holiday I drove home for, and cooked for, and cleaned up after, and drove home from without saying what I was thinking. There was nothing left to say. I got in my car. The truck pulled out ahead of me. I followed the red taillights down the empty street until they turned the corner, and then I turned the other way. Behind me, the sun was coming up over Nashville. In front of me, the highway was empty. Brittany's flight landed on Sunday morning at 10:14. I know this because I checked. Not out of anxiety, out of precision. I wanted to know exactly how much time there was between the moment her wheels touched the runway and the moment she would understand what had happened. It was approximately 47 minutes. Door to door, including the rideshare, traffic on a Sunday, and the time it would take to walk up to a front door that now belonged to someone else entirely. She called me for the first time at 11:02. 7 calls in 28 minutes. All from Brittany's number. All unanswered. What I was told later, not from Brittany, but from a neighbor who'd been watching from her porch with a cup of tea, was this. Brittany had arrived at the bungalow at 11:07. She had her key out. She had inserted it into the lock. The key had not turned. She had tried 3 times. Then she had rung the doorbell. A man she had never seen opened the door. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt and holding a mug. Behind him, on a leash tied to the stair rail, was a brown and white pit bull who looked up at Brittany with the mild, curious expression of a dog that has no reason to be concerned. The man said, "Can I help you?" Brittany said, "I live here." The man said, "No, I do." And then he closed the door. Politely, not slamming it, just closing it. The way you close a door when you have no reason to keep it open. Richard found out on Monday. Not from Brittany. Brittany was busy calling every number she had, trying to find someone who knew where I'd gone. Richard found out the way you find out about structural damage, by noticing, one by one, that the things you relied on are no longer there. He tried to log into the vendor portal his company used to manage supplier contracts. His credentials no longer worked. He went looking for the client contact files on the shared drive. The drive was empty. Not corrupted, empty. The way you empty a drawer when you are moving out, methodically, completely, because everything in it was yours to take. I had built that system over 4 years. The vendor relationships, the contact list, the renewal schedules, the service history for every property in the portfolio. I had built it because no one else had thought to, and because I understood, even then, that the things you build become the things you are. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't deleted anything that belonged to the company. I had simply taken what was mine. The colonial house. The house Richard had lived in for 22 years. The house he had called a family legacy. Sold 9 months after I left Nashville. The bank had called in the line of credit. The business was running at a loss. Brittany, by all accounts, had not contributed to the mortgage. The house sold for $418,000. 22 years. Gone. Not because I had done anything to it, because I had stopped holding it up. I heard the next part from a cousin, not directly, but secondhand, the way news travels through families that have fractured. Richard and Brittany had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment together on the outskirts of Brentwood. Thin walls, a parking lot view. The kind of place that announces itself through its smell before you see it. What my cousin described, with some discomfort, was the sound. Neighbors had started complaining. Screaming matches, late at night, carrying through the walls. Richard calling Brittany the thing she was. A person who had consumed every resource offered to her and produced nothing in return. Brittany calling Richard what he was. A man who had enabled her dependency for 30 years and was now furious at the predictable result. The man who had stood in my office and told me my duty was to support my sister was now screaming at her through a wall in Brentwood, telling her she had bled him dry. He was right, of course. He just didn't have the self-awareness to notice that he had handed her the needle. It was in the middle of a strategy meeting at my new firm that my phone showed a notification from my blocked messages folder. I stepped out onto the balcony. Los Angeles spread out below me, unhurried and indifferent, and nothing like Nashville. I pressed play. The voice that came through was Richard's, but altered. Not the Richard who had slapped my desk with his open palm. Not the Richard who had told me my duty was to support my sister. This was a voice I hadn't heard before. Thin, careful, trying to reconstruct something with its bare hands. He said, "Valerie, it's Dad. I've been trying to reach you." A pause. I was wrong about some things. About a lot of things. Another pause. Longer. The business is in trouble. I can't access some of the systems. I don't know the vendor portal login, and there are accounts I can't reach. I need your help. Come back and I will make you a full partner. Whatever you want. The recording continued. He said, "I'll ask Brittany to leave if that's what it takes. I can make her leave. Just come back and fix this." I stood on the balcony and listened to the entire message. I played it again. I wasn't looking for something I'd missed. I was confirming something I already knew. The man who had spent 30 years insisting that family meant I had a duty to support his favorite daughter was now, in the same breath, offering to remove her from his life the moment she became inconvenient to him. There was no love in what he had built between himself and Brittany. There was only utility. And when the utility was gone, so was whatever he'd mistaken for affection. He had tried to use me to hold Brittany up. Now he was offering to use Brittany to bring me back. I had simply been the latest instrument in a long chain of arrangements that had never been about any of us. I pressed delete. I erased his voice from my life the way you erase the last entry in a ledger you've decided to close. Not with ceremony, not with anger, just with the knowledge that the accounting is finished and there is nothing left to balance. I walked back into my meeting. Note to give you the bones. About 3 months after I arrived in Los Angeles, I had dinner with a woman named Patricia. Patricia had been my mother's closest friend for 20 years. She'd known me since I was 9. She was the only person from my former life who had reached out after I left. Not to ask me to come back, not to explain anyone's behavior, but simply to say, "I'm glad you got out." We ate at a restaurant near Culver City. She'd flown out for a conference. At some point during dinner, she put down her fork and looked at me and said, "You know, your father called me. About a month after everything. He wanted me to tell him where you'd gone." I asked what she'd told him. She said, "I told him I didn't know, and then I told him something else." I waited. She said, "I told him that Valerie has been carrying this family since she was 22 years old, and that the day she stopped, he would find out exactly how much she was carrying." She picked up her fork. "I think he found out," she said. We finished dinner. We talked about other things. The light in Los Angeles in December, a restaurant she'd read about on Abbot Kinney, a film she'd seen on the plane. I drove home along the 10, windows down, the city lights spreading out on either side. I wasn't thinking about Nashville. I was thinking about the morning light that came through my new kitchen window, the way it hit the walls. Not Portland white, something lighter. Something I had chosen entirely for myself. For the first time in 34 years, I was not there to absorb it. And that, more than the house, more than the folder, more than the wire transfer at 11:47 p.m., was the thing I had spent 6 years building toward without knowing it. Just not being there. Nobody how's important. When you try to... My apartment in Silver Lake has 11-foot ceilings and a window that faces directly east. I found it on a Tuesday, 3 days after I arrived in Los Angeles. I walked in, stood in the empty living room, looked at the wall, and said, "I want that one." Not because it was perfect, because it was mine to decide. I painted it the week I moved in. something I'd never had a name for, a very pale, very clean shade of off-white with the faintest undertone of warm stone. I stood in the paint aisle for 22 minutes choosing between 4 samples, and I didn't ask anyone's opinion. I know that sounds small. It wasn't small. Every morning I wake at 5:20 and make a single cup of coffee, French press, medium dark roast, 2 minutes steep. And I sit at the kitchen table by the window for exactly 15 minutes before I do anything else. The light comes in amber and flat off the water. The apartment smells like coffee and the lavender hand cream I keep by the sink. Nothing about that morning ritual has changed, except that there is no one here who might repaint the walls while I'm at work. I have no window into Richard and Brittany's life now, and I have not looked for one. What reached me? It reached me through the particular silence of people who have run out of things to say about themselves. What I know is this: the ledger is closed. The accounting is finished. I am not available to balance it. I learned 3 things from what happened. The first, shared blood is not the same as shared respect. I spent 12 years confusing the two. I assumed that because Richard and Brittany were family, the rules of basic decency, the ones I applied to every other relationship in my life, somehow didn't apply to them. That their access to me was unconditional, regardless of how they used it. I don't believe that anymore. Love is not the same as liability. Being related to someone does not mean you owe them unlimited access to your labor, your money, or your silence. The second, financial independence is not a safety net. It is the door. I had been saving, quietly, since I was 24. Not because I was planning to leave. I didn't know then that I'd need to. But because something in me understood that money buys you options. It buys you the ability to say, this is no longer acceptable, and then to actually leave. The folder mattered. The job offer mattered. But neither of those would have meant anything without the years of savings that made a wire transfer possible on a Wednesday evening without having to ask anyone's permission. The third, you do not owe anyone an explanation for choosing yourself. Not a confrontation, not a list of grievances, not a final conversation in which they understand, acknowledge, and apologize for everything they took. That conversation is a fantasy, and waiting for it is a way of staying. I sat across from Richard and Brittany at a restaurant table and said what I came to say. Not to give them closure, not to make them understand. I said it because the sentence needed to exist in the air between us at least once before I was done. Then I left. The explanation was everything that came before it. 31 days, a folder, a wire transfer, a highway at dawn. Those who were paying attention had already understood. The rest was not mine to carry.